Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Marcia, the webinar director here at Advice Chaser, and I want to welcome you. As you're coming in the webinar room, and before we introduce our guest today, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars, such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we're thrilled to bring you today's educational presentation. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box, and the presenter will answer those queries during or after the presentation today as appropriate. If you ask a question in the chat box and we're not able to get to you, go ahead and leave your contact information as well. And if we can't get to your question, we'll make sure someone reaches out to you after today's event. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter. Mark Seither is a partner and wealth manager with Kingsview Partners in Knoxville, Tennessee. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from San Diego State University and began working as a financial advisor in La Jolla, California. Mark enjoyed finding innovative solutions to clients' complex problems, and his desire to work with the entrepreneurial-minded helped him thrive as a financial advisor. As Mark honed his skills as an advisor and planner, he looked for a platform that would better pair with his desire to work with clients needing advanced planning and specialized fixes. He found his spot back in Northern California in early 2017 when he joined Trust CFO and assisted in integrating complex tax and estate planning with wealth and investment management. Since then, he has collaborated with Josh Saunders to build Kingsview Partners, and together they assist individuals on wealth management and tax strategies. And Mark, we're so glad to have you here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you, but I know we're going to have a little bit of back and forth during this webinar today.
Thank you, Marcia. Yes, very excited to be here. I actually did get my start in the insurance world, and when I did, admittedly, this is one of the topics that was in absolute shambles, right? It was one of those things where it was a very, very difficult situation. We'll kind of see why that is here in today's presentation, but it still remains a very prevalent threat to a lot of people's financial plans and legacy. And so we did want to go over 4 ways that people are solving this. So now what we are going to cover is the various ways that people address their long-term care planning, and the different pros and cons of each one, because they all have different things that they're really good at, really bad at. There's different things that they solve, and then we'll have some questions you should consider when reviewing what's right for you, because again, everything is going to have a pro and a con, and it's really designed for, hey, what are you trying to get out of this thing, right? And what works for your financial circumstances as of today.
I would just make a comment here. It's nice to talk about options because I know everyone's financial situation, it's different. And so, it's not a one size fits all kind of issue at all.
Yes. And on that note, we typically, when looking at our financial future, we address the most current needs first. And so this does become something that becomes a back burner issue. And the longer it stays a back burner issue, the more narrow your options can become, right? And so And I 100% understand when people say, hey, I can't really address this right now, right? But it is just something to always keep forefront of mind, like, hey, the longer I wait, the less my options are realistically going to be towards the end. So now,
Well, thanks for that intro. I know we aren't going to cover some things, and so let's talk about those.
yeah, so what we're not going to cover is what triggers a long-term care event, right? We did do a webinar with Peter Lofgren on Advice Chasers, so he covers what what triggers certain events, and also the different styles of long-term care, right? There's a couple different ways that you can receive your care. There's also public resources available, right? That's not going to be part of today's conversation, especially since it's usually state specific, what's available for you. And then the specifics about getting into a facility or hiring the right person, right? That's more of a, hey, how do I actually map out and execute my long-term care plan versus how do I pay for and cover my long-term care in the future, which is what today's conversation is more focused on.
Right. And I will just interject here that Advice Chaser does have a good amount of resources for people who are looking for this information in our library. And you're welcome to go to the advicechaser.com website to find that.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Now, to give some context around long-term care planning, this is very common. Actually needing long-term care is a very common thing. It's more common than some people realize. The rising cost of medical care is even in today's high inflationary numbers is still surpasses for the most part typical inflation, and specifically elder care. So there's the medical care, but then there's for end of life elder care. That cost has gone up so much that obviously the price of the insurance has gone up as well, right? And so it's becoming more and more aware that it's more and more needed, and it's getting more and more expensive, right? Which is just a absolute pleasure of a conversation to go into with clients when they are stressed about long-term care planning. And then the costs of the care, and this is really where you probably don't want to wait too long before addressing how you can make sure this gets addressed, is that the cost of the care can severely diminish or completely wipe out what someone has in their estate, in their basically their net worth. And it can result in things like passing on bills to your beneficiaries are going to inherit bills rather than assets, right? And that's never what people are intending. An anecdotal story is I did have a someone in my family that they ended up not addressing long-term care planning, and a little bit earlier than you would have expected. They had a circumstance where they needed in-home care, and it was for about 4 years. And at that point, it was the only thing they could do is dish out the money, right? And everything was actually not, all the conversations were not around, hey, how do we take care of, how do we pay for so-and-so? The actual conversation that the rest of everyone was having was, how do we then care for their surviving spouse who will have nothing left if this continues too long, right?
Yeah, I can see that being a major problem. Hey, Mark, you talked about it's very common. Can you maybe let us know a little bit? Is it like 1 in 4 people, 1 out of 2? What is it like?
Yeah, so the depending on the study and the year that you look at, it can be anywhere from 65 to 75% of people who are of age 65 today are going to require it in their lifetime.
And then do you know about how long? I mean, is it just for a couple years, for the rest of their life? I mean, of course, it's an average.
Yeah. So females end up needing it for I think it's around 4 to 5 years. Men less. We call it quits early. So you can plan on, well, you can't plan on, but when you're looking at averages, men will be in a long-term care situation for roughly 2 to 3 years on average, and women 4 to 5 years. And again, with that 65 to 75% number, that's a very high. If you're looking at and it's not a perfect example, but you're looking at people insure their cars because they have to, but they insure, they get additional insurance. They make sure they're well insured for things that really are not very likely to happen, but would be devastating if they did happen. Well, this one would be devastating financially if it did happen, and it's likely to happen, right? And so that just kind of adds a level of, I mean, I don't want to say scariness, but it is kind of, when you're looking at, your financial future and your financial plan, it is kind of the looming, it's the looming dragon that's out there ready to go scorched earth at it, at some point. So it's definitely worth looking into. And that's, one of the reasons why today we're going to go over
All right.
Different options.
Well, I know that insurance plays a major role for a lot of people. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that, what role it plays.
Yeah, so long-term care insurance is the most common thing people will think about when they want to look at insurance, long-term care planning. And many long-term care insurance providers have dropped out of the market entirely, right? And so that does complicate things a bit. And the reason why they dropped out was because they did not foresee so many people needing it and how much it was going to cost. And so, as an insurance company, you're saying, okay, well, I want to charge people for the amount of risk I'm taking. Well, they actually way undercharged people, right? Because they were just like, hey, the mortality table says that you're going to die at 68, right? Well, people ended up living to 78 or 85. And they said, hey, inflation is X amount. And it just so happened that inflation for long-term care was way more than that. And so a lot of insurance companies, and this is why I said when I got my start, in the insurance industry, it was a bit of in a bit of shambles, because a lot of insurance companies were coming to the realization that they had so many people on their books that they were going to have to pay for. They didn't have the money to pay for it. They did, but they couldn't take on any more clients, right? And so it was either, hey, we need to drastically increase the amount of money we're charging. We need to drastically limit what we promise to cover, or we need to get out of the industry in general. And what they found was, no matter how many times they ran the numbers, when they drastically increased premiums or drastically decreased, or both, the benefits, nobody wanted a policy anymore, right? Because it was like, well, why would I pay all that money for such little? And so a lot of them were like, hey, we're going to take care of the clients that we have, but we can't afford to stay in this market. So that's been so it's been a challenge, but long-term care still is one of the top threats to a person's intended plans, right? When people look at, hey, here's what I want to live on, here's what I want to give to family, here's how much I want to retire on. A long-term care event can, it's still a top threat. Now, luckily, the industry has responded, right? So where there is issues and a need, and there's money to be made by solving that, we now have some options. So we're going to go through these 4 ways that you can now plan for your long-term care planning and protect your financial balance sheet and your legacy plan. The first one is there has been a lot of work done in the long-term care insurance, traditional long-term care insurance. It's more fine-tuned to meet specific needs, and so there's still plenty of solutions still in that world, even though there's fewer providers. There have been developments in the life insurance industry where they will add a long-term care benefit to your death benefit. Same with annuities. There's annuities where you can say, hey, I want, this is the annuity, but if I go into long-term care, this is what I want to have happen. And then something called a cash indemnity life insurance policy, which is a little bit newer to the scene, but definitely has plenty of functionality when it comes to solving these planning issues. So,
all right, well, let's get into it. Now, I'm not an insurance expert at all, and so I might ask questions that our viewers have. And viewers, if you are struggling with any of the terminology or anything like that, go ahead and put that question in the chat. I'll make sure to ask it of Mark.
Perfect. Yes. So long-term care insurance. So for this is the one that is the most commonly known off the top of people's head, right? When they think of covering their long-term care expenses, and this is the way that most people were able to cover it is, they've fixed the or I shouldn't say fixed, but they've changed certain things to where they can say, hey, do you want to wait 90 days versus 100 days before you get care, right? That can help control costs of care. Do you want X amount of dollars per month, or do you want more, less, right? That will help control costs of costs to the insurance company and to you. So it can be extremely customizable. Also, when you go into when you're looking at a facility, it's a very favorable thing to throw down there on your application, like, hey, I'm going to want care. It's going to be expensive, and here's how I'm going to pay for it, right? And if you have a very mapped out, if just like anyone, right? They want to know how you're going to pay for it. Anyone who's bought a house knows that you got to prove you can pay for it. Well, if you can show them, your bill is $7,000 a month, and I've got $6,000 a month coming from this, and here's where the other $1,000 is going to come from. It's very favorable that you're going to get in, because that is another thing that a lot of people have found is sometimes you just can't get accepted into a facility. It's not like they just take everybody. It can be difficult. So proving that you can pay with long-term care insurance is great. And then they did end up coming up with better inflation protection for long-term care benefits. So for people who had certain long-term care policies and just found that, like, hey, that's great that I have this, but the cost of care is super expensive and this is not covering a fraction of it. They now do have, hey, we're not going to cover just general inflation. We're going to cover specifically long-term care for your area inflation, which has been a nice add-on to make sure that people know exactly what they're going to get, and they know exactly what it's going to pay out, from an inflation standpoint. Now go ahead.
Yeah, the question here is, so do these policies usually have like a term and they end?
So it depends on the structure of the policy. Most policies are you pay for it forever, right? A lot of them have a they don't have like what's called a paid up feature. But some again, there's a million different policies out there, right? So I can't speak to all of them, but for a lot of times when you take out this long-term care policy, it is a, hey, just incorporate this in your monthly bills, and this is going to be how this works. Now, some of the cons of the long-term care insurance is it is a standalone policy that can be very expensive. So depending on when you apply, depending on your health status, it's still for the amount that they've been able to fine tune things and the amount of bells and whistles they've added to control costs, it can still be expensive. There is no, and there's no cash value component. So we'll go into some of the different answers or some of the different solutions here coming up. But some solutions have hey, you have your long-term care covered, but if you're in a incident where there's not long-term care needed, you still have a cash value component. So there's none of that. Premiums tend to increase. So
it's not a flat premium.
Yeah, there's, and some do have a flat premium, but it's just much more upfront. And, it's just one of those, it's a budgeting thing, right? You really want to do your homework and know exactly what you're, I'll typically tell people, hey, we got to know how we're going to pay for this thing when like 3 different things go wrong, right? Because it's one of those things where you can't just say, hey, I'm not going to pay for a while, right? The underwriting can also be very time consuming. So I have heard, and they're just stories, but I have heard specifically from a close friend of mine that there was someone they had a client who years ago had, gotten an accident and, bumped their head, went to the doctor, went to a 3-month follow-up with the doctor, and the doctor said, like, you're fine, but come back in 3 months, right? Come back in 3 months, and we'll just do one last check. The person just never went back, right? Because they're like, he said, I'm fine, I feel fine, I'm not seeing, I'm not having any ongoing issues. Well, the insurance company said, that was never resolved. You have an ongoing head trauma for the past decade. We're not going to cover you, right? So they can be very picky, right? So, for people who have maybe some things that they're, that they think are questionable health-wise, it can be, hard to qualify. And then, probably the biggest concern that I run into when people are reviewing this option is, we look at, okay, how is this getting paid if 3 things go wrong? It's like, well, if you can't pay it, then the policy goes away and the money you put in goes away. So again, it does become a budgeting thing. It becomes a budgeting thing, and it's, because you can't say, hey, I gave you $150,000 over the life of this policy. Can I at least get some back? Because it's insurance, right? It's not exactly how that works. Now to go into the life insurance side of things. Life insurance, a lot of these insurance companies that sold long-term care insurance were also life insurance companies. And they did come up with okay, how can we help people plan for long-term care without using the traditional long-term care insurance? And so adding a rider to your life insurance policy, a rider is basically just an add-on to your life insurance contract, specifically for long-term care or what they call an accelerated benefit, which basically is a fancy way of saying we're going to pay you a death benefit. So we're going to give you, we've got a portion carved out that you can use early, right? So we're going to accelerate.
All right.
Yeah, we're going to accelerate.
So that's what that accelerated means,
Yeah.
is that usually the insurance company would pay your beneficiaries that death benefit.
Yeah.
But this is like activating the death benefit before you have passed.
Loosely, I'm sure an insurance attorney would be like, well, technically, right? And go through the legal jargon of it. But as I mentioned before, as some people had experienced, hey, I incurred all these costs, I had to dish out a bunch of money, and now I'm just passing off bills to my beneficiaries. This is a way to have a life insurance benefit towards like, hey, I incurred all these costs, and I actually used some of this instead of my estate, so that I still had something to pass on, and there's just less death benefit when I passed away. So it's not a use it or lose it product. It's not hey, go into a long-term care facility or you are out the money. It does build cash value, right? So I had mentioned the long-term care insurance doesn't build cash value. It does build hey, you have a death benefit. you have a long-term care benefit, and you have what's called cash value, and that is if you're in a circumstance where you just need cash, depending on how much you need, you can pull some and have it not be long-term care related. So it does double as a legacy planning tool, right? Because you can say, sweet, if something happens to me and I pass away, there's this death benefit to go bless, family members. And if something happens and, something happens and I incur all these costs, I can have that solved. I can still have some death benefit to give, but I won't have to sell my assets in a fire sale to go pay for long-term care planning. And then also you can budget affordable premiums, right? This one's a little bit more, especially for people who, maybe their parents just got through a long-term care facility and passed on. If you're nowhere near needing long-term care, or at least you think, right? Because we never know. But the insurance company, you can basically say, okay, well, if I get a head start on this, maybe I do make my premiums extremely affordable, and the premiums don't go up with inflation, right? There's not an increased premium. And so in 10, 15 years, this will feel like a very small bill, very manageable when I factor in my investments and my Social Security and my, whatever other planning I've done. And you can actually take what's called a paid up policy and quit paying into it, right? There's lots of things to, I'm basically opening an infinite amount of possibilities here, but it's definitely more flexible that way. The downsides is, when you add that long-term care rider, you do typically take a hit on the death benefit side, right? Obviously, because they're saying, hey, we are promising you more benefit, right? So we've got to, we're going to reduce the death benefit. So if you were to pass away tomorrow, there's just less money that's going to get passed on. So if you were looking purely from a death benefit standpoint, it would take a hit from that side. The amount you receive in these hybrid policies, and this is where working with someone very knowledgeable with the policy is very, it's very important, is that long-term care benefit, that rider, it may say, hey, you have $250,000 of long-term care, benefit available, but you can only take a portion, you can only take so much out a month, right? You can only take $5,000 out a month, $6,000 out a month, right? So you may need to, again, do some math behind, okay, how much do I want to take out a month? How, again, at that point, it becomes a math and a time problem. But it's not just like, hey, you can't just walk in and be like, I've got $250,000 a long-term care benefit rider. I want the fanciest, like caviar, caviar for breakfast long-term care facility, right? You're not going to be in, La Jolla in California, right there on the beach, probably, right? I mean, like it's not going to be where many of us would like to have our long-term care facility with an uncapped bill. There's going to be some limitations there, and then the underwriting, they typically do still require, hey, for just regular boring term insurance, a lot of times they don't require medical anymore. They may pull medical records, but if you're young enough, I mean, they typically do, minimal underwriting. If you had that long-term care rider, they're gonna get a, most people are gonna have to get a medical, whether it's insurance directed or through their healthcare provider, they're going to have their medical records pulled. Again, they want to see things like, hey, like, does are you a smoker, and does your, do you come from a long line of people who, pass away of lung cancer before age 65, right? Do you have certain hereditary things, so there is still some underwriting involved there. So that's the life insurance component. Now, for people who want a little bit easier underwriting, typically easier underwriting.
We'll go on to that. But before you go on to the next option, we did have a couple questions come in.
Sure.
So how do you find a policy with an accelerated benefit rider? Is that relatively easy to find?
So I would say go through an independent, someone who's independent,
Like a really,
professional.
or like an insurance broker who works with several companies.
So you don't want, if you work for a, we call them captive agents, right? They're going to give you that company's specific, product, and that's about it. So going through someone who is able to shop the market has, I'd say a good key indicator is someone who actually knows a lot long-term care insurance, but heavily filters everything through people who are, even more knowledgeable than them, right? Because the industry is changing a lot, it's changing fast. And, I've got certain people on speed dial for certain things, right? Like taking disability insurance for instance. I mean, I'd blow my, I'd lose my mind if I just all day read about updates in the insurance world, right? So definitely saying, hey, a very solid grasp of how this works, not tied to any insurance company, and has plenty of resources of people beyond them who can say, hey, here's what's happening, with this company, because I've had professionals say like, hey, I would stay far away from that company right now, like, because we know that they're having some struggles in this department or that department, right?
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's good to work with someone who has your best interests at heart, of course, and not captured.
Yeah.
Like you said. All right. Well, let's go on to another option. I know we've covered kind of more traditional type options and the life insurance option. Let's talk about an annuity.
Yeah. So annuities, for anyone who is unaware of what an annuity is, I mean, this isn't really an annuity webinar, but I mean, it's another insurance contract, and I'm happy to have a side conversation, or it's a 15-second Google search to learn basically everything you need to know about what an annuity is. But they do have, typically have easier underwriting. They typically are only concerned about, hey, you're not already in a long-term care facility, right? I mean, that, because obviously that would be an issue. But for non-long-term care related reasons, I've had people go the annuity route just because it's like, oh, well, I know there are some things that a life insurance company is going to have issues with underwriting wise, and so annuity is a bit better of an option. It's also for certain circumstances, it is a much easier funding process, right? So with the long-term care insurance and with the life insurance, I talked about, hey, we've got to back into a number, we've got to find a bill that works for you. Like this one's going to go up with inflation, this one's going to stay flat. So for an annuity, in most cases, people will say, okay, well, I have $500,000. I'm not going to need long-term care insurance for an extremely long time. I have no idea what's going to happen in the long-term care industry between now and then. What would maybe the number is 100,000, right? Where it's like, if I could just fund upfront in something with $100,000 today, and then I can just focus on growing my 400,000 in the future, knowing that, okay, sweet, I have my long-term care or accelerated benefit rider annuity funded. I know how it's going to work. I know when I can pull money. I know all those things. I can just shift the rest of my focus onto growing the rest of the money. That for a lot of people, that just it's way easier planning wise, right? Because now they've segregated those issues into two different things. It's not a use it or lose it, right? So the annuity, you can eventually say, hey, pay me at this rate. Well, the insurance company tells you how much they're going to pay you, but But at some point, let's say you get to 75 and you're like, yep, I'm ready to start collecting on that annuity. And they'll say, okay, do you want it monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually? Here's how much we're going to pay you. We're going to pay you for the rest of your life. If you have an annuity like that, or you could structure it to pay you for 10 years or whatnot. But the accelerated benefit or the long-term care component, the nice thing there is, let's say the annuity company says, or the insurance company says, hey, for your annuity, you annuitize it at this point, we're going to pay you $3,000 a month for the rest of your life, right? If you live to 150, we're going to pay you $3,000 the rest of your life. And if you go into a long-term care facility, we're going to bump that up to, let's say, $7,000, right? So that's where you can say, okay, awesome. I can build in this kind of like a little mini pension, right? My self-funded pension. But I know if I go into a long-term care facility and my expenses get a whole lot bigger, my income from that specific, thing I'm relying on, that part of my overall plan is also going to increase, right? So it helps on that side. Also comes with a death benefit. So for people who are concerned about, in most cases it comes with a death benefit. For some people, they do get concerned of, if I put, 150,000 into this thing and I annuitize it, right? And I've only spent like $7,000 out of it, and then I pass away, the insurance company doesn't go give out bonuses with all that excess, right? That's not what happens. There's typically a death benefit component, and there's a cash value component as well. There's still money that you can, still pull back if you need it, right? There's, with the caveat of, you got to look at what your surrender charges are and for how many years, those surrender charges last, but there are ways to get the money back, right? If you're not in a long-term care facility.
All right. Before you go on, you said surrender charges. I'm not sure what that means. Can you explain what a surrender charge is?
Yeah. So the insurance company, obviously insurance companies got to make money, and they should make money. They're taking on the risk and everything. And they know that, hey, if we take on the risk and you cancel this thing next year, we're going to keep some of the money. If you put 150,000 in and next year you say, I want all of my money back, there's going to be a charge saying, okay, well, we're keeping X amount. And the longer you hold the annuity, the smaller that surrender charge gets. So in 5 years, it may be down to a very minimal amount. In 8 years, it may be down to nothing. So that's the surrender charge portion of just saying, hey, if you cancel this thing, that's how much the insurance company keeps out of what you cancel. The other component is they will tell you, hey, you can take 10% back, and every annuity different, right? But this is a very good general, common situation, is they will say, hey, every year you can take 10% back if you want. You can take 10% out penalty free, right? And so, you can see how that would be advantageous from an emergency standpoint to know, okay, well, I put 150,000 in, and 3 years later you have an emergency, and it's okay. Well, you can still access a portion of that money penalty free, right? Now it's gonna impact your long-term care projections. It's gonna impact your potential annuity, annuitized income projections. But we're talking about an emergency here, so it's obviously it's either this or go broke. Very much so a pro, to be able to take some money back and not have it be like a traditional insurance where it's like, well, that money's gone. Like the premiums that you've put in are tied up.
All right, we have another couple of questions here.
Yeah.
So with the annuity, so in your example, you said, if you have $500,000 and 100,000 of that is going to a plan like this, is that all given up front, or is that in installments? How are those payments usually structured?
So it's typically given up front, right? They do have some that have installment plans, but they're relatively short installments, right? So like 18 months, 2 years, right? And I have been, part of situations where, people say, well, this is what I want, but I have some things tied up, right? And so it's like, okay, well, we can structure it in a couple different payments. But typically you're going to be looking at, if we're looking at the extreme ends, this one's going to be closer to the upfront, right, on the funding, whereas like the life insurance, is kind of on the other side, because you can, again, at 55, say, okay, well, I'm going to start funding this thing knowing that I'm going to be building all these other benefits and set up my payment, basically fund my life insurance planning, right, between 55 and 85. Whereas this is more of a, hey, we're going to fund this, but it's going to be, very upfront. It's not going to be a little bit over a long period of time.
So I guess it's one of the pros of this also is that, once you've done it, it's done, and you don't have to
Yes.
worry about that as a bill.
Yeah, so it's, the upfront funding, and you can see there's kind of, it kind of landed in the pros and cons section, because it does depend on the person's situation. You can
Right.
easily shift assets into something like this and say, sweet, this is done, check the box, moving on. But for some people, especially if you're looking at, hey, I don't like the underwriting part of the life insurance, I don't like this aspect of the long-term care insurance, and I really do want that annuity option, it's gonna require more upfront capital, most likely. And there's also, now we're kind of getting, we're getting nitty gritty, but if people are willing to sit through insurance speak, awesome, because I can never find someone to listen to me talking about insurance.
I feel like the people here on this webinar, if you're
Yeah.
attending a webinar about long-term care insurance and long-term care solutions,
Man,
they're here for it.
If I can invite you to come to my house during the holidays, because if I ever go into this like during the holidays, it's just like,
Yeah, so we were just talking about how it can be like a pro and a con to have that money taken care of up front, but if you don't want to deal with that life insurance underwriting.
Yeah, and there was this, gosh darn it, I went for the joke and I lost what the specific thing I was going to talk about with the upfront funding.
That's okay. I have another question here.
Okay, perfect.
Is there an age limit to qualify for these long-term care plans?
So as you get older, there are some that, they do have cutoffs. They'll say, hey, we'll insure up to age, 86, up to age 88, up to age 90. But then even then, there are some that start restricting certain benefits of it, saying, hey, after this age, you can do the annuity with the long-term care, but we're not going to do, we're not going to do a death benefit add-on, right? So you'll still get the contract value, right? Which is essentially, hey, I put 150 in and I'll still get some money, the value of the contract back. But it won't be like an added death benefit to the annuity. And so you do limit yourself that way. And then, also on the kind of on the con section there, the inflation protection, may not match the specific long-term care inflation, because it's typically tied to, hey, this is your annuity with your, and it's being used as a potential source of income down the road. And so the inflation is tied to general inflation rather than specific,
I see what you mean. So it's not necessarily tied to the industry of long-term care.
Yeah,
it's tied to the overall inflation, throughout.
And some do have that. I do believe. It's just not everyone does, and it's again, you're talking about thousands of different ways of structuring something, and with every different
Absolutely.
way, it's going to be a different, different cost. So, and then lastly, if you do annuitize, I had mentioned, hey, you can pull some money back. You can pull some money back. You can take some out penalty free over a given amount of time. Once you annuitize the contract, and basically once you tell the annuity, the insurance company, hey, pay me X amount at this rate, and they agree to that, at that point, that cash portion is frozen. So,
Yeah.
most times people will, they'll hold off on
The whole,
annuitizing it, because they're
uh-huh.
like, okay, the moment I do that, like I can't tap
It's
into it like
locked
I
in.
used to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's locked in. Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, let's move on to this next one. I know that we want to spend
Yeah.
a chunk of time here because this is a newer product, you said.
Yeah, this one's a little bit newer to the scene, and so a cash indemnity life insurance policy it's being positioned to help solve the long-term care issue. And one of the issues that people had with the long-term care writers was that it was very specific on what it could cover. And if you want to learn more about that, I mean, again, I had that webinar with Peter Lofgren. He is far more knowledgeable on the actual steps of long-term care and different things that trigger different qualifications of coverage. But one of them was, okay, well, I need to be seen in home, but what I need is not that complicated. And the insurance company is still saying, well, you got to hire a professional. You can't just hire a friend or family member, right? And so these cash indemnity policies came around, and it was, hey, you can have a long-term care instance, and however you solve that, we'll reimburse you up to a certain amount, right? And so it loosened up the need to go get in a facility or go do things by the insurance rule book. They were more so saying, we have X amount of dollars that we'll dish out at X amount of frequency. However you want to use that is up to you. So on the pro side, there's typically a shorter surrender period than the annuities. So there's not that, hey, if you pull it back, if you need the money back, you can only take it in 10% chunks, or we keep a portion. It's usually a shorter period for that. Like I said, it's more flexible in how you use it. It can sometimes have better inflation protection than the annuities, right? Because it is specifically for, it is designed with long-term care in mind. It does obviously come with a death benefit. So there's a little bit of dual planning there of saying, this is my long-term care, this is my life insurance need, and I'm covering my long-term care, or I'm covering my life insurance need, but there's a death benefit, or sorry, I keep saying long-term care. This is my death benefit need. I'm covering my death benefit need. It just is serving a dual purpose on the long-term care side. And the cash is still available for non-long-term care instances. So, again, if you end up in a circumstance where you need cash and it's not exactly for long-term care, you can take distributions out. It does impact the future of the long-term care benefits. So, don't treat it as a big, if you have an emergency around Christmas time every year, that may be an issue. They, on the con side, they do require upfront funding, right? This is probably the most extreme on the upfront funding. This is hey, put the money in as soon as possible. There's little to no cash value growth. So that is something where, hey, you put 150,000 in, it's very liquid, very soon. And that's awesome. Your long-term care benefit, very, very flexible, very usable, grows, inflation protected, very awesome. But in 10 years, that cash value component is still going to be that same amount, right? it takes it a very long time for it to hit any period where it starts growing. Now, I will say that the plus side of that is typically, I would say in my experience, people end up needing less upfront funding just because the long-term care component does grow, I'd say a little bit more aggressively. So there's that component, but it does, a little less flexible upfront. Once the premiums are pulled, like if you do end up in emergency, again, we go back to that 150,000 scenario. If it's, hey, had an issue, had these things happen, and we absolutely need the money, you can get the money, but that is giving up the benefit, right? So there is getting your cash back, but losing the coverage. Now, some people also see that as a pro because they will say, well, Mark, I'm young. I can afford to only put 75,000 in there right now. Or not only afford to, but I only need to put 75,000 in there so that the long-term care component, basically is what it needs to be at the time of, me likely needing this. If I end up not needing it, if laws change and all of a sudden I can get free coverage, yeah, getting all of my money back, that's awesome, right? Like I'm more than happy to go into something where I know I can at least get my money out. So that is a con for most people, but for some people they do value that. And then it does require life insurance underwriting, just like the other life insurance. So if there is something where you're concerned or you do have ongoing, I had if you're like, hey, back in April, I had a heart attack, healthy as a horse, doctors give me the green light, had a stent put in, like I'm not a smoker, not overweight, I'm a very healthy, active individual. I just happen to have a heart attack at a young age. That's still, you'll probably still get cleared, but it's still going to raise some eyebrows and you might end up qualifying for less, so just know that there is that component to the life insurance cash indemnity policy.
I do have a question here, Mark. Why is it called, can you explain why it's called cash indemnity?
Yeah, because it's, essentially you're going to go get a problem fixed. You're going to go, like, let's say that you want in-home care. You need to modify your home for your in-home care. You need to put in a ramp, and you need to put in a new bathtub, and you need to pay someone to help facilitate certain daily activities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, with with traditional insurance, there may be certain channels you have to go through. There may be certain things that you have to buy. But if and maybe this makes me sound like a cheapskate or kind of oaky, right? But if you find a used walk-in bathtub, right? If you're like, hey, there's this secondhand bathtub I can buy on, that I know someone who's selling it, right? And I, can hire someone local in my community to build a ramp, right? I don't have to go buy, I don't have to go through a special certain someone. And
right, you're not using like an approved provider that the insurance would say we'll pay for it, but only through these approved providers.
And maybe and I'm going to have my daughter help me with the daily activities, right? But I'm going to compensate her for it. She's not licensed, she's not a professional, but it's time out of her day and I want to compensate her for it, right? So you can say, hey, here's the things that I set up, here's the things that I paid for, and given the certain contract and what's allowed to be dispersed every month, those can be covered, right? You can hire your son to build, you can pay your son to build your ramp, right? You can buy that, buy those in-home care tools you need, second rate from someone that and you'd rather pay a discounted price for. You can hire a family member or friend to help take care of you. It doesn't have to go through someone who's going to charge exactly the amount that is required for them to charge. And so if you want to stretch you want to stretch the dollars a little bit longer, that is a great thing to look at, to give you some more flexibility. And you know, like I mentioned, some people see the cash value not growing as a downside, and other people see it as a, okay, well, if I can have this covered and I can avoid, you know, this catastrophe to my plan, and at bare minimum get all my money back, that's like, move that up to the pro section, get that out of the con section, right? So it all depends on what you want, and really your financial plan should cover quite a few different scenarios. And so, you know, if you want to make sure that you're finding the right solution for you, right? Because you have to consider your time horizon for care, both until you need care and how long you'll likely need care, your health status today, the desires and concerns of what you have financially going on. And then financial suitability. Oh, throwback to what I was going to talk about, and then I went for the joke. Financial suitability. There, you know, insurance companies do have what's called a suitability test, to where you have to have a certain amount of liquid net worth, and so you also, if you're going the annuity route, they may say, hey, you don't have enough liquidity to where you can handle an emergency. So you actually can't put, you know, I've had people who, because they were on fixed income and, you know,
they didn't
enough,
qualify for an annuity.
They didn't qualify. Exactly. They were like, we have, you know, for them, it was, I think, you know, around 50,000, I think. But they didn't have enough sitting in excess, that the annuity company was like, well, no, I mean, we won't take it because you don't have enough cushion. And so, you know, that's also something to consider. So
and that's called suitability rules, or
yes, you know, financial suitability.
Financial suitability. Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
So that's key. So you want to make sure, hey, what kind of care do you ideally desire? Do you want to go into a facility? Do you want it to be high end? Do you want it to be, you know, something where it's in home? You know, you can have someone come to the comfort of your own home. What are some barriers you might run into health wise, right? That may eliminate some options. For certain health situations, I will actually go through a pre-underwriting questionnaire, so that I can basically go to different insurance providers and say, like, hey, hypothetically, if I had a friend who had these issues, what would you do? And if they say, oh, I'd reject them, then we know, okay, like, let's not even put that on your insurance record. Do you have the, you know, kind of going back to the three, you know, hey, what happens when three things go wrong, right? What's your financial resources for taking care of this and making sure that the planning we put in place actually holds? And then what other areas of your financial plan are of equal or greater value, right? So that kind of comes into,
I think you meant threat.
Sorry,
equal or greater threat. Yes.
Equal or greater threat, sorry. Value of concern. Yeah, equal or greater threat, because, you know, you may have things that it's like, hey, this is the one thing that goes wrong that implodes your long-term care planning, right? So maybe it is, you know, maybe it is you don't have enough money, you know, for retirement, right? So if that's an issue, maybe the annuity is a better thing to look at, because that's going to provide you some income coming up. You know, maybe you do have, you have some liabilities that make your spouse a little bit worried if you're not there to provide for, you know, those liabilities. It's like, okay, maybe the life insurance is a decent thing to focus on, because even though it has those cons, your spouse, you know, kind of going back to the situation we had a couple of years, you know, I'll say it was almost a decade ago. Wow. Where it was, hey, we have these financial obligations. If something happens to that person, how do we possibly support the surviving spouse, right? That might eliminate some options. So just make sure, you know, you're going to have multiple things that you're trying to accomplish, and each thing is designed to address one or two of them. If you can find out which, you know, long-term care and this are highly they're top priorities for me, then that's probably going to be where you start looking first to solve that issue.
Well, we're going a little bit over time, but I do want to ask a couple of questions if you
Yeah.
have a couple more minutes. I promise folks we won't go too much longer, but I do want to
Yeah,
address
absolutely.
these. All right. So here's a question, and I think this is a really good one. What if you don't have any beneficiaries? You don't have a spouse, you don't have siblings, you don't have any children. So you don't really need like a death benefit per se. What thinking about that, what kind of solution might be something to think about?
So if that's true, then there's you have kind of two things going on. One, you're not going to have any help, right, if you get into a long-term care situation. So maybe the
Right.
top thing you want to look at is, how do I want to be cared for, right? If I have in-home care, but I don't have anyone that I care enough to leave them a death as a beneficiary, then they probably don't care about me enough to, come take care of me and live with me for a while. So that would probably be a good point of the first thing to look at is like, okay, well, do you want to move into a facility where someone is there to take care of you 24/7? Or do you want someone, to have someone come out every day and check in on you, right? Because now we're not worried about the death benefit component. And the other one would be, potentially a cash indemnity policy, because now you're not so much worried about like, hey, I've got to make sure this thing, grows, and there's, this has to cover, other people if I'm out. It could be more of an easy, like, okay, well, I put my minimal amount upfront in, and I know what my death benefit's going to be. And by me locking up that much cash, I'm not leaving anyone hamstrung if I'm not around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and I would also just interject too that anything specific, obviously we can't address because, everyone's life is different and there's lots of different components.
Yeah.
And that's why, having a financial plan is so important. This is just a component of the financial plan. It has to work in concert with what you have, in addition to all the other issues, surrounding long-term care. Let's go ahead and ask this question here. Can you talk a little bit about when it is appropriate to look at covering long-term care, what age people should kind of be looking to cover this?
So I'll give you the typical insurance answer, then I'll give you the more realistic answer, right? The typical insurance
All
answer
right.
is yesterday, right? That's what everyone usually says, like, man, if you haven't looked at it, you got to look at it now. Which isn't 100% wrong, right? Because if you're looking at just getting educated on it and knowing what your options are, I mean, I personally, I think it took me 9 months to finally buy a car, because it was, I just was like, hey, the more information I can take in and the more I can assess things, the better. You want time on your side. So education early and knowing what's available, key. The two times that people typically look into long-term care planning would be when someone is like late 70s, early 80s, and they all of a sudden see a friend go through something, and they see how much it costs, or they, they're finally at an age to where, they're not traveling as much, and they start thinking about these things more, is typically the first, like, oh shoot, I never did this and I should do this, right? And so that's unfortunately when, our options have dwindled down a bit. The second most common time I get asked about the long-term care planning options is after somebody's parents or uncle has gone through it, and they see what it did to the family, right? They see what it did to, and not to say that there's a greed component, but there is typically a like, oh yeah, our inheritance was way less than it was going to be, right? Because they ended up spending, $350,000 over the course of X amount of years, and that's just money not then passed on to the kids. But also it's very emotionally taxing, right? It's very stressful for the entire family when there's no long-term care plan or no specific person who's going to take care of mom and dad. I've heard disaster stories of siblings who that was the last time they talked to their sibling, their brother or sister was like, oh yeah, when mom and dad went through that and they didn't help enough, or they didn't do this, they didn't fork out enough money, right? It just became such an emotionally devastating experience. And then you lose your parent. That's typically when they're like, hey, I want to make sure my kids never fight like I fought my siblings, right? And I want to make sure that I don't become the reason why our family's dysfunctional moving. Now that's kind of an extreme example, but it's not really that extreme in the sense that it does happen fairly often, right? And it's especially not everyone has the same financial ability to support their parents, right? And so that becomes an issue when it's like, hey, mom's in a state-run facility that's run down. She's not getting good care. I'm willing to fork out X amount of dollars to get her better care. And the other two siblings are like, well, we're not, right? It can create a lot of this. And then, when that happens, typically the person who, was most emotionally impacted, they're the ones who are, going and saying, okay, well, I've got 3 kids. I don't want my 3 kids I don't want to be the reasons why they don't talk anymore. So that typically happens around, I'd say 55 to 65 is there's a big, peak in interest in how to solve that, because they just had a 85-year-old
personal experience
you know,
with that in their own family.
yeah.
I can see that. So yeah, definitely a good time to be talking about that. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close up things. I did have another couple of questions come in, but I don't have time to address them. So
Mhm.
I'm going to go ahead and save the chat. And what I'll do is if you can just leave your contact information, I'll make sure to reach out to you after today's event, make sure those get addressed. So here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who is a great fit for you. I want to thank Mark for being here and for the organizations that have made this webinar possible today. We're getting some thank yous in the chat, and I really appreciate that. I know Mark does too. At Advice Chaser, we're happy to help you find a financial advisor, like I said, who's a great fit for you, your life, and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, for Advice Chaser, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for spending your time to get educated today. And we hope to see you at another webinar very soon. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And we're getting some more thank yous and a great topic. So thanks, Mark.
Thank you.